Welcome to Module 1. In this particular module, we're going to start with the definition of gangs. So the first thing we want to look at is the issue of definition. And though gangs have really been studied for probably the last 75 years, the actual definition is still in dispute. And for any study of any social phenomenon, we need to make sure that we are looking at the same thing that others are looking at so that we're having the same conversations. So our first critical step in this journey is, how do we define gangs? Moreover, as we're police officers, we generally have the kind of personalities that would like to have a clear-cut understanding of what we're dealing with. That's why we have ops plans. That's why we look to the criminal code to give us definitions of what is a crime and what isn't a crime. We look to the policy and procedure manual. We want to know where we stand in life, generally speaking. Certainly, I think most of us do in our professional occupation. Just like ERT, just like patrol. They get the call of shots fired in a house. Patrol's going to arrive on scene first. Patrol's going to do certain things. We're going to make sure that we all understand when we say that the house is iced. The ERT officers arriving know exactly what we mean by that. We have most people have a general understanding when they're doing containment about being in a position to challenge, talking about a numbering system of a house, so that we're all on the same page. It's the same thing when we're looking at any kind of social phenomenon. However, when you start to get into the reading, and I appreciate that it's fairly dry, we're looking at the history of just how people have defined gangs. There's a lot of variety out there. A lot of debate by academics about what gangs are, and as we get further into the course, I'm going to make some suggestions about how we use the term gangs here in British Columbia would be much different than what people would expect of gangs in other parts of the world. Clearly, the term gang is an ambiguous term. It changes over time, it changes over place, it changes from the perspective of a police officer to a social worker, to a youth worker, maybe even to a school liaison officer. What can we say generally about gangs that is accepted? Primarily, male membership. Throughout the world, generally speaking, males dominate gangs. However, when we look at this, we know that female gangs are emerging. We also have to consider, at least out of the research out of the United States, that 85% of street gangs in the United States consist of some racial or ethnic minorities. Gangs in the United States can be located in all types of communities. Small towns, big cities, particular areas of cities. Gangs are a very concerning, emerging trend for policymakers, government, educators, academics, criminal justice personnel, and of course the police. The average age in the United States is between 16 and the early 20s, and a lot of the gangs in the United States are territorial in nature. When we're talking about gangs, we probably will never have a completely universal definition of gangs. So we as students of the gang phenomenon need to be careful that when we're looking at studies that were done in one area using the term gang, and we look at studies that were done in another area using the term gang, are we really talking about the same thing? Absent of a clear, generally universal definition, we need to be clear that are we comparing apples to oranges, apples to apples, or more likely what we're comparing here in British Columbia is apples to apples and oranges. There's a huge diversity from youth gangs all the way up into organized crime groups. While we do know that in the United States of America, and to a certain extent among some gangs here in Canada and in other parts of the world, that youth are clearly impacted by clothing, videos, jewelry, sign, symbols. We don't have to look far to see support the big red machine. These are things that we should be concerned about, because what we're really seeing is youth that, rather than emulating legitimate profession structures in society, they're actually emulating illegitimate structures. That should be concern to us as a society, because our youth are preoccupied with gangs and gang violence. The grandfather of gang research is really a person named Frederick Thrasher. His research was in 1927, And he came up with this term, interstitial group. And he had generally said that these groups or gangs, were formed of spontaneous groups of youth. And it was dependent on how society reacted to those groups, or what those groups found themselves up against, whether or not they would in fact turn into a gang. Was it a spontaneous group? What kind of conflict did they existed for them in their communities would be a big determinant in whether or not they became a gang. What we do know from Thrasher is that, generally speaking, these people that were involved in these groups or gangs had a collective behavior in internal structure. They had an esprit de corps. They had group awareness. And finally, they provided each other a high level of morale and solidarity by being part of the group. While we don't specifically look at the chapter that Mike Chelberg starts his book, Young Thugs, in our reading, we do look at one of his chapters. What's interesting about his book is, as you start to read it, he describes the fact that when he was in his younger years, that in fact he was part of a gang, as defined here. He was part of a group that had internal structure, esprit de corps, group awareness, high morale and solidarity. That was his Pee-wee hockey team. So we need to be careful as we look at these definitions that those definitions can't be applied inappropriately to other groups in society. For Thrasher, this interstitial concept is not just about time and place. He talks about how youth that were involved in gangs, youth entering the gang, would be also matched with older people leaving the gang. He also talks about Chicago, the business district of Chicago in 1927, and this area between the business district and where the newer homes were built. I was amazed this summer when I visited Chicago for a gang conference at how clean the downtown core of Chicago was, how crime-free it was, how the police were everywhere. I asked a homicide detective from the Chicago police, I'm amazed, this is the third largest city in America, how clean it is, how crime-free it is. And he chuckled. I said, I haven't read anything in the newspaper while I've been here that had anything to do with any homicides or anything like that. He once again chuckled. He said in one weekend they had 46 people shot. In Chicago, there are clearly defined areas that are not very good areas for you to go. These are gang areas. I listened to an academic while I was there who had a map of Chicago, and he showed all these red dots where all the homicides had occurred. He showed another area where there was no red dots. He asked the group, the audience, made up of police, corrections, social workers, educators, academics, what do you think it is about this neighborhood up here where there's no red dots? Funnily enough, he also explained that in the city of Chicago, if you're a police officer or a firefighter, you have to live in the city of Chicago. That was the corresponding absence of shootings in those areas. For Thrasher, this is a critical point. Key determinants of group is how they are perceived by others. If these people are allowed to behave in a certain way in their communities, gangs are acceptable, they will continue to flourish. I recently asked a criminology class here at Kwantlen in regards to how they felt when they went out to nightclubs in the city of Vancouver. How do they feel when they went out to clubs in Surrey? And they clearly have almost a defeatist attitude that gang violence is here and it's here to stay. I found that very disheartening as a police officer, and I hope you do as well. For Thrasher, though, when he looked at these groups and gangs, he didn't concentrate solely on delinquency. He looked at the collective behavior, the esprit de corps, the morale building, and the solidarity of that group. The next academic we're going to look at is Albert Cohen. Albert Cohen's work was in 1955. He clearly said that these groups that formed into gangs were a collective response to social problems, social status. They were basically the neighborhood kids who had been given a certain labeling to them, and they were going to behave a certain way because of that. Some of the issues there had to do with the social networks, the social issues in the community that they're growing up in. This is a critical point for what we're going to look at here in British Columbia. We don't have the experience of large neighborhoods of poor socioeconomic issues that are these factories for gangsters. Our gang problem is considerably different. Many of our gangsters come from affluent families, wealthy families, or certainly upper middle class families. For Cloran and Olin, their studies in 1960, they said gangs were formed because of an interaction between legitimate and illegitimate opportunity structures. For them, if you were a youth growing up in a certain neighborhood and you didn't have an access to jobs, education, role models, the forming of the gang was clearly a mechanism for you to seek out some of the things that you're striving to get, that we're all striving to get, but you don't have the legitimate access to those things. So through joining of a gang, you're able to access many of the things that we are all looking for in our lives. The last academic we're going to look at is Miller. Now, Miller's research is interesting. He studied gang members. These are people who participated in his study by self-identification of being involved in a gang. 85% of those respondents said they had self-formed association of peers. They were bound together by mutual interest. They clearly had identifiable leadership. These youth also identified they had well-developed lines of authority. There was structure to the gang. Other organizational features, and they acted in concert to achieve a specific purpose, whether that be crime, protection of their turf, protection of themselves, or the promotion of their gang and their role within the community. We're also going to look at, in this chapter, we have a social research paper, and that's going to talk about methodology. And that was something that came from one of the academics that reviewed this course for validation, that was something that they felt was important for you to look at. It's a short paper, 5 pages. It's written by a criminology student for me. Each module has a short quiz. You have your slides, you have this video, and hopefully you're enjoying this class as we move forward. Thank you.